The key turned in the lock with the sound of grinding rust, a complaint of disuse that echoed in the vast, empty corridor. The Duke, Gideon Devereaux, pushed the heavy oak door inward, revealing a cavern of dust motes dancing in the single shaft of afternoon light. He gestured into the gloom. "This was the nursery," he said, his voice as devoid of inflection as the gray stone walls. "The late Duchess had plans for it. They were not completed." Constance Bellamy stepped over the threshold, her worn half-boots making no sound on the grimy floorboards. The air was thick with the scent of sealed-up time, dry rot, faded lavender, and something else, the faint, sorrowful perfume of abandonment. A rocking horse, draped in a spectral white sheet, stood sentinel in one corner. A crib, half assembled, lay in pieces like the skeleton of some small creature. Covered furniture huddled in the center of the room, a silent congregation of ghosts. The Duke remained in the doorway, a tall, severe silhouette against the light of the hall. He had not looked at her, not truly, since she had become his wife an hour ago, in a brisk, impersonal ceremony at the Marley magistrate's office. "You will have the east wing. My rooms are in the west. The child, Rosamond, is with her governess. You will take your meals in your own parlor, unless I send word otherwise." He recited the terms as if reading from a deed. This was a transaction, nothing more. He required a duchess to secure his daughter's inheritance, a woman of unimpeachable reputation and no social ambition. His solicitor had found him Constance Bellamy, a poor relation with a mind for figures, impeccable comportment, and, most importantly, no expectation of affection. Constance's gaze fell upon a small, intricate birdcage near the window, its delicate wires bent and broken. "And this room?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear in the tomb-like silence. "It is to remain locked," he stated. It was not a request. "Mrs. Nash, the housekeeper, has the only other key. She will not give it to you." He looked at her then, his eyes the color of a winter's sky, and for a fleeting second she saw something beyond the cold dismissal. A flicker of profound, walled-off pain. He was a man entombed with his grief, and this house, Kestrel Chase, was his mausoleum. He had brought her here not to bring it to life, but to serve as a respectable warden for one of its wings. "I understand, Your Grace," she said. He gave a curt nod. The matter settled. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, each one a hammer blow driving a nail into the coffin of her old life. The sound faded, leaving only the profound silence of the great house. Constance stood alone in the abandoned nursery, the dust settling around her. She was the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. She was 24 years old, and she had never felt more like a ghost herself. She did not cry. She had learned long ago, in the stifling, gilded cage of her aunt's drawing room, that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value. Instead, she took a breath, the dust catching in her throat, and surveyed her new prison. It was cold. It was empty. But it was vast. And for the first time in her life, she was not under the constant, critical gaze of her aunt, Lady Honora Bellamy. Here, in the forgotten heart of a grieving duke's home, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And in that aloneness, a strange, unfamiliar seed of possibility began to stir. She ran a single, gloved finger over the dusty frame of the broken birdcage. The gesture was not one of pity. It was one of recognition. Her life with her aunt had been a study in diminishment. For 10 years, since her parents' deaths had left her a penniless orphan, Constance had been Lady Bellamy's unpaid companion, bookkeeper, and general dog's body.
She managed the household accounts with a razor-sharp precision that saved her aunt from ruin, while her cousin Flora practiced the pianoforte and sketched mediocre watercolors. Constance's reward was a small room in the attic, Flora's cast-off gowns, and the constant, dripping poison of her aunt's resentment. Lady Honora could not forgive Constance for her quiet intelligence, for the competence that highlighted her own daughter's charming ineptitude. Each balanced ledger, each perfectly negotiated butcher's bill, was a fresh offense. "So clever with sums, Constance," Lady Honora would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A pity such a talent is so masculine. It does a woman no favors in society." The summons from the Duke of Kestrel Chase had arrived like a thunderclap. He had requested a private meeting with Lady Bellamy and her niece. Honora had been giddy, certain the famously reclusive widower had emerged from his mourning to court the pretty, pliable Flora. She had spent a week preparing her daughter, drilling her on polite conversation and ensuring her dress was the height of modest fashion. Constance was instructed to be present but invisible, to sit by the window with her mending and speak only when addressed. The Duke had entered the drawing room, and all the light and air seemed to rush toward him. He was not handsome in the way of the young dandies who courted Flora. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, his expression closed, his bearing that of a man who had seen too much of the world and liked very little of it. He had greeted Lady Honora with chilling formality, bestowed a brief, uninterested glance upon a blushing Flora, and then his gaze had settled on Constance. He had watched her for a long, unnerving moment as her aunt chattered on about the latest society gossip. He saw the worn cuff of her sleeve, the ink stain on her forefinger, the way she kept her spine ramrod straight in a chair designed for lounging.
Lady Honora, sensing his attention had strayed, tried to reclaim it with a jab.
"Constance, do stop frowning over that shirt, dear. You'll get lines. One must think of one's appearance."
Constance had not flinched. She had simply folded the garment neatly, set it aside, and met the Duke's gaze with a calm, level stare. She said nothing. She did not need to. The entire dynamic of the household was laid bare in that one brief exchange. Later, when the Duke had made his formal, shocking proposal, it was not for Flora. It was for Constance. He spoke to her directly, ignoring her aunt's sputtering protests. "Miss Bellamy," he had said, his voice low and direct, "I require a duchess. Your reputation is spotless. I am told you are possessed of a formidable intellect and a practical nature. I offer you the protection of my name, a household of your own to command, and an exceedingly generous settlement to be held in your name alone, untouchable by any other party. In return, you will perform the social duties of a duchess, act as a nominal mother to my daughter, and you will not expect from me any sentiment. It will be a contract. Do you understand the terms?" Lady Honora had been apoplectic. Flora had burst into tears. But Constance had felt a sudden, shocking clarity. A household of her own. A name that would protect her. An independent fortune. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was an offer of emancipation. She looked at the cold, unsmiling Duke. A man offering her a cage of gilded steel in exchange for her current one of shabby brass. And she saw a path to freedom. "I understand the terms perfectly, Your Grace," she had replied. "I accept." Now, standing in the dust-choked nursery of Kestrel Chase, she felt the full weight of that acceptance. She was a duchess, a wife, a stepmother. But she was also an employee, a signatory to a contract. Her duties were clear. Bring order to this house. Perform a role. Stay out of the West Wing, and leave the past locked in this cold, silent room, undisturbed. She turned her back on the shrouded furniture and the broken bird cage, and walked out into the echoing hall to begin her work. The first task, as always, was the ledgers. The books of Kestrel Chase were a disaster, not through malice, but through neglect. The late Duchess, by all accounts a creature of whimsy and charm, had possessed no head for figures. The Duke, lost in his grief, had let everything slide. Stewards paid bills twice over, merchants inflated their prices, and waste was rampant. For 2 weeks, Constance sat in the small, cold estate office, a room no one had used in years, and brought order to the chaos. She worked from dawn until dusk, her only companions the scratching of her pen and the silent delivery of her meals by a grim-faced maid. The housekeeper, Mrs. Tilly Nash, observed her with undisguised suspicion. Mrs. Nash had served the Duke's mother and had adored the first Duchess, a beautiful, laughing girl who filled the house with flowers and music. This new Duchess was a different creature entirely. Small, quiet, dressed in drab gray, she was more clerk than chatelaine. Mrs. Nash saw the endless stream of ledgers going into the office and sniffed with disapproval. The house needed a mistress, not an accountant. Constance did not try to win her over with charm. She had none to spare. Instead, she used facts. On the 15th day, she summoned Mrs. Nash to the office. The housekeeper arrived with an air of embattled loyalty, ready to defend the old ways. Constance gestured to a chair, but Mrs. Nash remained standing, a pillar of rigid disapproval. "Mrs. Nash," Constance began, her voice even, "I have reviewed the household expenditures for the past year. We are paying the butcher in Marley 20% above the market rate for beef. The linen supplier has been billing us for twice the yardage we have received since May. And the wine merchant has charged us for 3 casks of claret that, according to the cellarman's own log, were never delivered." She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the facts she had unearthed, her finger tracing the lines of figures in the ledger. Mrs. Nash's expression shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. She was a practical woman, and she knew inefficiency when she saw it. She had long suspected the Marley butcher was a thief, but the late Duchess had found him charming and refused to hear a word against him. "What do you propose to do, Your Grace?" the housekeeper asked, the title sounding slightly less like an accusation. "I propose to visit our suppliers in Marley tomorrow. You will accompany me. You know the quality of the goods. I know the price they should command. Together, we will rectify the situation." Constance closed the ledger. "I have also drawn up new inventory protocols for the linen closets and the pantry. I will require your assistance in implementing them." It was not an order given from on high. It was a request for collaboration, an acknowledgement of the housekeeper's expertise. For the first time, a flicker of something other than hostility appeared in Mrs. Nash's eyes. It was not warmth, not yet. It was something harder and more respectful. It was the recognition of competence. The trip to Marley was a quiet triumph. Constance, armed with her figures, was implacable. The butcher blustered, the linen merchant whined, but, faced with her calm, factual evidence, they capitulated. New terms were set. Better prices were secured. On the carriage ride back to Kestrel Chase, Mrs. Nash sat in silence for a long time. Then, as the great house came into view, she spoke. "The first Duchess," she said, her voice stiff. "She never troubled herself with such things." Constance looked out at the imposing stone facade of her new home. "I am not the first Duchess," she said quietly. It was a simple statement of fact, but it hung in the air between them, a declaration of intent. She was not here to imitate or replace. She was here to build something new. That evening, a small fire was lit in the grate of her parlor without her having to ask. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning. A single log, catching flame in a cold hearth. The child, Rosamond, was a pale, silent little thing with her father's solemn gray eyes. She was 5 years old, but seemed to carry the weight of a much older soul. Her governess was a stern, humorless woman who believed children should be managed, not nurtured. Constance observed them for a week, watching from a distance as Rosamond was drilled on her letters and her sums, her small face perpetually pinched with concentration. There was no laughter. There were no stories. Constance began by dismissing the governess, providing her with a generous severance and a letter of recommendation that praised her efficiency, while omitting any mention of warmth. Then, she took on the role herself. She did not try to force affection. She knew a child's trust, like a housekeeper's respect, had to be earned. She began with a simple routine: lessons in the morning, in the dusty, unused schoolroom, a walk in the gardens in the afternoon, rain or shine. During one of their walks, they passed the east wing, and Rosamond's gaze went to the locked door of the nursery. "That was Mamma's room," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For the baby." Constance paused, her heart giving a painful clench. She had learned from Mrs. Nash that the first Duchess had died in childbirth, the infant son with her. This room was not just an abandoned project. It was the site of the tragedy that had hollowed out this house and its master. No wonder he kept it locked.
She was going to paint stars on the ceiling, Rosamond added, her small hand tightening in Constance's. Silver stars. That night, Constance found Mrs. Nash in the main hall, overseeing the polishing of the silver. "I require the key to the nursery," she said. The housekeeper froze, her hand hovering over a tarnished ewer. "His Grace gave express orders, Your Grace. It's to remain shut." "His Grace ordered that you were not to give me the key," Constance corrected her gently. "He said nothing about me acquiring it by other means. The door is old, the lock is simple. I am sure the master locksmith in Marley could fashion a new one for me. Or," she added, her gaze steady, "you could lend me yours. I will return it before morning." Mrs. Nash stared at her, a battle waging behind her eyes. Loyalty to her grieving master versus a dawning loyalty to this strange, quiet woman who was slowly, methodically, stitching the house back together. She saw the set of Constance's jaw, the quiet determination that had faced down the thieving butcher. She knew the new Duchess would not be deterred. With a sigh that seemed to come from the soles of her feet, the housekeeper reached into the deep pocket of her apron and produced a large iron key. "See that it's back on my ring by sunrise," she muttered, not meeting Constance's eye. "And I'll know nothing about it." Constance took the key. It was cold and heavy in her hand, the weight of a promise. She said nothing, only gave a small nod of thanks and went upstairs. She opened the door not with a creak of rust this time, but with a well-oiled click. The room was as she remembered it, a tomb of dust and memory. But tonight she had brought a lantern. In its warm golden glow, the space seemed less daunting, more expectant. She set the lantern down and went to the windows, forcing open the stiff latches. Cool night air, smelling of damp earth and coming rain, rushed in, disturbing the dust of years. It felt like an exhalation, a long-held breath finally being released. She did not try to clean everything at once. That was not her way. She began with one small corner. She took a dust cloth from her pocket and began to wipe down the intricate broken birdcage. She worked slowly, methodically, her mind quiet. This was not about erasing the past.
It was not about replacing the woman who had dreamed of silver stars. It was about letting in the air. It was about making a space for life to begin again. She spent an hour there, in the silent, breathing dark, cleaning one small object in a room full of ghosts. And as she worked, she felt for the first time not like a warden or an employee or a duchess by contract, but like a woman in her own home. Before the first hint of dawn, she locked the door behind her and returned the key to Mrs. Nash's ring, just as she had promised.
The housekeeper said nothing, but the next morning, a bucket of soapy water and a stack of clean cloths were left just outside the nursery door. The change in Kestrel Chase was gradual, almost imperceptible. It began with sound. The echoing silence of the halls was now punctuated by the distant, rhythmic thump of carpets being beaten, the clatter of polished silver being returned to the dining room, the murmur of maids' voices where before there had been only whispers. Then came the light. Constance had the heavy velvet drapes, thick with the dust of mourning, taken down, cleaned, and replaced with lighter linen. Sunlight, for the first time in years, streamed into the great hall, illuminating the faded glory of the family portraits. The Duke remained a distant, solitary figure. He took his meals alone in his study, spent his days riding the vast estate, and his nights, she assumed, with his ghosts in the West Wing. Yet, he noticed. He could not fail to. He saw the gleaming floors, the fresh flowers in the vases, simple wildflowers from the meadow, not expensive hothouse blooms, and he smelled the scent of beeswax and lemon that had replaced the must of neglect. He saw it, and he said nothing. His silence was a wall she could not seem to penetrate. Her work on the nursery became her private ritual. Every night, after the house had settled, she would let herself into the sealed room and continue her quiet reclamation. With Mrs. Nash's unspoken complicity, she had the furniture uncovered, the floors scrubbed, the walls washed down. The half-assembled crib was dismantled and stored in the attic. The shrouded rocking horse was revealed to be a magnificent creature of carved oak, its paint faded, but its form noble. She polished it until the wood gleamed. Rosamond, sensing a change, grew curious. "What are you doing in there?" she asked one afternoon, her small voice hesitant. They were in the garden, planting seeds in a small, neglected patch that Constance had tilled herself.
"I am making a room ready," Constance replied, not looking up from her work. "For a baby?" Rosamond's voice was tight with an anxiety she was too young to name. "No," Constance said, meeting the child's worried gaze. "Not for a baby. For stories. And for painting." She paused, then added, "And perhaps for stars." A flicker of understanding, of wonder, passed through the child's solemn eyes. From then on, a silent pact existed between them. The nursery was their secret. Sometimes Rosamond would leave a particularly pretty wildflower or a smooth gray stone on the floor outside the door, a small offering to the mysterious work being done within. One evening, the Duke was returning late from his ride. As he passed through the upper hall, he saw a sliver of light from under the nursery door. He stopped, his hand clenching into a fist. He had given a direct order.
The room was to remain locked. He strode to the door, ready to deliver a cold, furious reprimand. But the sound from within stopped him. It was Constance's voice, low and steady. She was reading aloud. He could not make out the words, only the gentle, soothing cadence, and underneath it another sound, a small, happy sigh. He leaned closer, peering through the old-fashioned keyhole. He saw Constance sitting on a low stool,
a book in her lap. Curled on a rug at her feet, her head resting against Constance's knee, was Rosamond, fast asleep. The room was transformed. It was clean, airy, and lit by a dozen candles that made the space glow with warmth. On the ceiling, he saw the faint, penciled outlines of 1,000 tiny stars. He straightened up, a strange, constricted feeling in his chest. He had commanded this room be a tomb, a monument to his loss. But this quiet, determined woman he had married had defied him. She had not broken down the door in a fit of pique. She had simply found a key, opened the lock, and patiently, persistently, let the light back in. He looked at the scene before him. The woman he barely knew, and the daughter he barely recognized, so peaceful and content, and felt a crack appear in the icy wall he had built around his heart. He did not knock. He did not confront her. He simply turned and walked back to his own wing. The image of the candlelit room and the penciled stars burned into his mind. It was not pity he felt watching her. It was something harder and more respectful. It was awe. News of the Duke's marriage spread through the county like wildfire, and with it, speculation. The consensus among the local gentry, led by the sharp-tongued Lady Arabella Sinclair, was that the poor, grief-stricken Duke had been taken in. Lady Arabella had considered herself the natural successor to the title of Duchess. Her family and the Devereuxs were old allies, and she was beautiful, accomplished, and, most importantly, available. She could not comprehend why Gideon had overlooked her for a drab, penniless nobody. "A bookkeeper's daughter, I hear," she would say at tea, her voice laced with pity. "So clever, they say. But breeding, you know. Breeding will out. One simply hopes she knows her place." Lady Honora Bellamy, now ensconced in a lavish London townhouse funded by the Duke's generous settlement to her, fanned the flames. She painted a picture of Constance as a cunning, ambitious schemer who had manipulated her way into the marriage. She always had a head for figures, Honora would sigh to her circle of gossips. I suppose she calculated the value of a ducal coronet down to the last shilling. Constance was not deaf to the whispers. During her trips to Marley, she felt the curious stares, the sudden silences when she entered a shop. The invitations that arrived at Kestrel Chase were few, and those that did come were tinged with a condescending curiosity. She was a novelty to be inspected. She ignored them all, focusing on her work. The estate was beginning to thrive. The tenants, accustomed to years of neglect, found their fences mended and their cottages repaired. The ledgers balanced to the penny. The house was warm and alive. And Rosamond had started to laugh. The Duke's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess Lady Maud Devereux, arrived unannounced one Tuesday afternoon. She was a formidable old woman, with eyes as sharp as a hawk's and a tongue to match. She had openly disapproved of the marriage, seeing it as a dereliction of Gideon's duty to his line. She swept into Kestrel Chase, prepared to find a vulgar upstart destroying her family's legacy. She found Constance in the garden, on her knees in the dirt, showing Rosamond how to tell the difference between a weed and a seedling. Constance rose to greet her, wiping her earthy hands on an apron, her composure unruffled. "So," the Dowager began, foregoing any pleasantries, "you are the accountant." "I am the Duchess, Lady Maud," Constance replied, her voice calm. "And yes, I am also an accountant. The two are not mutually exclusive." Lady Maud was taken aback. She had expected deference, perhaps even fear. She received only quiet, unassailable confidence. Over the next 3 days, the Dowager Duchess conducted a thorough inspection of the house, the staff, and her new granddaughter by marriage. She tasted the soup, checked the linen closets for moths, and cross-examined Mrs. Nash. She expected to find chaos and mismanagement. Instead, she found order, efficiency, and a staff that spoke of their new mistress with a fierce, protective loyalty. On her final evening, she found Constance in the library, a book of poetry in her hands. "Gideon tells me nothing," the old woman said, sitting opposite her. "He has always been a closed book. His first wife, she was starlight, beautiful, brilliant, and all too brief. She nearly bankrupted him with her whims, but my God, the house was alive. When she died, the light went out. He locked it all away. I thought he would never open the doors again." She looked at Constance, at her plain dress and her capable hands. "You are not starlight. You are lamp oil. Not glamorous, but steady. You burn for a long time, and you keep the house warm." It was the closest the Dowager Duchess would ever come to a compliment. When she left the next morning, she kissed Constance on the cheek. The county took note. An alliance had been formed. This, however, only hardened the resolve of her enemies. An endorsement from the formidable Lady Maud made Constance not just an oddity, but a threat. Lady Arabella and Lady Honora, meeting in London, concocted a more direct plan. Slander was not enough. They needed proof of her unworthiness, something that would force Gideon's hand. They needed a weapon. And in the resentful, grasping heart of Lady Honora, a truly vicious idea took root. A forged letter. A letter that would not just disgrace Constance, but would strike at the very heart of Gideon's world. His love for his daughter. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The letter was a masterpiece of cruelty. It was written on paper identical to Constance's own, the handwriting a passable imitation of her neat, precise script. It was addressed to a fictional cousin in the North, a co-conspirator in her plan. The contents were devastating. The writer complained of the sullen, difficult child she was saddled with, speaking of Rosamond as a mere obstacle. It detailed a plan to have the girl declared unwell and sent away to a remote sanatorium in Switzerland, leaving the writer in sole control of the Devereux fortune and her husband's affections. It was calculated to strike every one of Gideon's fears, that he was a poor father, that his daughter was unhappy, and that he had allowed a predator into the heart of his home. The letter was found by a maid in Lady Honora's employ who had been planted on the Kestrel Chase staff weeks earlier. The maid, feigning distress, delivered it not to Constance, but directly to the Duke. He read it in his study, the doors closed. He read it once, twice, a cold fury building in his chest. Every honeyed warning from Lady Honora, every pitying glance from Lady Arabella seemed to coalesce around these damning words. He had allowed himself to be lulled by the quiet competence, the warmth that had begun to seep into the cracks of his house. He had watched her with his daughter, seen the blossoming affection, and had begun to hope. This letter tore that hope to shreds. He did not summon her. He went to find her. He knew where she would be. He walked the long corridor to the east wing, his measured footsteps a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He found her, as he knew he would, in the nursery. She was on a small ladder, a brush in her hand, carefully painting one of the silver stars on the now deep blue ceiling. Rosamond was sitting on the floor below, directing her. "A little to the left, Mama," the girl said, her voice clear and happy. She had started calling Constance Mama a week ago, a hesitant question that Constance had answered with a simple, warm hug. The sound of the door opening made them both turn. Rosamond beamed. "Papa, come see! Mama is making the Great Bear!" Gideon's eyes were fixed on Constance. His face was a mask of stone, colder and more remote than she had ever seen it. All the nascent warmth between them, the unspoken understanding that had been growing in the quiet spaces of the house, vanished as if it had never been. "Rosamond," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Go with your nurse. Now." The child's smile faltered. She looked from her father's rigid face to Constance's questioning one, and sensing the sudden chill, she scrambled to her feet and fled. Constance descended the ladder, placing the brush carefully on a nearby cloth. She faced him, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She waited. He held out the letter. His hand was perfectly steady. "Did you write this?" His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was not an accusation. It was a question, demanding a factual answer, as if he were asking about a household account. She took the letter. Her eyes scanned the familiar script, the cruel, alien words. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of cold, clear anger. It was a violation, a twisting of everything she had tried to build. She thought of Rosamond's happy, trusting face. She thought of the silver stars. She thought of the quiet hope that had begun to grow in her own heart. She looked up from the page and met his gaze directly. Her own was as unflinching as his. There was no pleading in her eyes, no tears, no hysteria, only the unvarnished, powerful truth. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the room. "I did not." He watched her, his gray eyes searching her face for any sign of deceit. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock in the hall. He had a choice to make. He could believe the evidence in his hand, the plausible lie that confirmed the world's cynical opinion. Or he could believe the evidence of his own eyes, the quiet, steady woman who had brought light and order to his home, who had earned his daughter's love and his housekeeper's loyalty. He could believe the forgery, or he could believe her. "Very well," he said, his voice still betraying nothing. He took the letter from her hand, folded it, and placed it in his breast pocket. He turned and left the room without another word, leaving her alone under a ceiling of half-finished stars. The silence he left behind, 1,000 times heavier than before. She did not know if he believed her. She only knew that the battle for Kestrel Chase, and for her own future, had just begun. For the next week, a glacial cold descended upon Kestrel Chase once more. The Duke was a ghost in his own house, seen only in passing, his face a remote, unreadable mask. He spoke to Constance only when necessary, in clipped, formal tones that created a chasm between them. Yet he did not send her away. He did not confine her to her rooms. He did nothing. This state of limbo was a unique form of torture, and Constance felt the whispers and stares of the staff intensify. They sensed the rift, the ducal displeasure. Only Mrs. Nash remained steadfast, her expression grim, but her service unwavering. "He's a man who weighs his evidence, Your Grace," the housekeeper said one evening, a quiet offering of hope. "Give him time." But Constance knew time was a luxury she might not have. Lady Arabella Sinclair and Lady Honora Bellamy would not be content with this silent stalemate. Their attack had been designed for a swift, decisive result, and its failure to produce one would only spur them to further action. The invitation arrived on a silver tray. The Duke was hosting the annual harvest dinner, a tradition that had been dormant since his wife's death. The county's most prominent families were invited. It was to be Constance's formal debut as Duchess to the local society, the very society that was whispering about her downfall. She understood at once. This was not a celebration. It was to be a trial, a public reckoning. She spent the day of the dinner in a state of calm resolve. She chose her gown with care, a simple, elegant dress of deep blue silk, the color of the nursery ceiling. She wore no jewels, save for the thin gold band on her finger. She would face them not as a dazzling duchess, but as herself. When she descended the grand staircase that evening, the great hall was ablaze with candlelight and filled with the low hum of conversation. As she entered, the chatter died away, replaced by a wave of intense, silent scrutiny. She saw Lady Arabella near the fireplace, radiant in crimson, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Beside her stood Lady Honora, her expression one of sanctimonious pity. They looked like vultures, waiting for the kill. Then she saw the Duke. He was standing by the hearth, watching her approach. For the first time in a week, his eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw not coldness, but a clear, sharp intelligence. He was not a man lost in a fog of doubt. He was a general, surveying his battlefield. He stepped forward and offered her his arm. "Your Grace," he said, his voice loud enough to carry through the silent hall. "You look magnificent." It was a public declaration of support. A shot fired across the bows of their assembled enemies. A murmur went through the crowd. Lady Arabella's smile tightened. The dinner was an excruciating affair. The conversation was stilted, filled with veiled barbs and pointed questions directed at Constance, all of which she answered with placid composure. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, the Duke rose. A hush fell over the room. "I have gathered you all here tonight," he began, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "Not just to celebrate the harvest, but to address a matter of some gravity. A piece of malicious gossip has recently come to my attention. It concerns my wife, the Duchess." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Lady Arabella and Lady Honora. "It has been suggested that she is a woman of deceitful character, with nefarious plans for my daughter." Lady Honora dabbed at her eye with a handkerchief. "Oh, Your Grace, it pains us all to think it." "It has been proven," the Duke continued, cutting her off, "by a letter supposedly written by the Duchess, outlining these plans." He withdrew the forged letter from his pocket and held it up. "I have the letter here." Lady Arabella leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. This was it. The public humiliation, the casting out. "I am a man who believes in evidence," the Duke said, his voice like chips of ice. "So I had this letter examined. I sent it to a handwriting expert in London, along with samples of the Duchess's hand from the household ledgers. His conclusion was unequivocal. The letter is a forgery, a clumsy one at that." A collective gasp went through the room. Lady Honora went pale. Lady Arabella's glass of wine trembled in her hand. "But that," the Duke said, a dangerous edge to his voice, "is not the most interesting piece of evidence I have to share. In her work to bring order to this estate's neglected finances, my wife uncovered a number of discrepancies. A pattern of systematic theft stretching back 2 years. Overpriced goods, phantom deliveries, wages paid to non-existent staff. A scheme that has cost this estate thousands of pounds." He let that sink in. "The architect of this scheme was my former steward, a man who was dismissed last week. A man who, it turns out, was deeply in debt to a certain Lord Sinclair. He turned his gaze fully onto Lady Arabella, whose face had crumpled into a mask of horror. "A man who is your father. The steward has provided a full confession detailing how the stolen funds were funneled to your family to cover your father's gambling losses. He also confessed that the price of his silence was to help you discredit my wife so that you might take her place." The room was utterly silent. The exposure was absolute, brutal, and complete.
"As for the author of the forgery," Gideon continued, his eyes now finding Lady Honora, "the handwriting expert noted similarities to letters he had previously examined in a minor inheritance dispute. Letters written by you, Lady Bellamy. The same unusual flourish on the letter B, a fortunate coincidence." He placed the letter down on the table. "You came into my house to accuse my wife of being a thief and a liar. But it is you who are the thieves. It is you who are the liars." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, devastating weight of the truth was enough. He looked at Constance, his expression clear and open for all to see. "The Duchess is the most honest and capable woman I have ever known. She did not come here to take from this family. She came here and saved it from ruin. This house, this family, and I are forever in her debt." Lady Arabella Sinclair fainted. Lady Honora Bellamy simply sat, frozen, her face a ruin. The public reckoning was over. Constance had been vindicated, not by her own pleading, but by the cold, hard facts her own competence had brought to light. The great hall emptied quickly, the guests fleeing the scene of social carnage. Lady Honora and a revived, weeping Lady Arabella were shown the door with icy efficiency by the butler. The house fell quiet. The staff moved silently, clearing the remnants of the disastrous feast. The battle was won. Constance stood by the window in the blue drawing room, looking out at the moonlit gardens. She felt a strange sense of calm, the quiet after a storm. She had endured. She had been vindicated. The contract she had made had been fulfilled. She had brought order to his house, and he had given her his protection. The transaction was complete. She heard his footsteps behind her and turned. Gideon stood there, his formal dinner coat discarded, his expression stripped of all its ducal armor. He looked, for the first time, simply like a man. "I am sorry," he began, his voice low. "I am sorry you had to endure that I allowed it to go on for a week." "You needed to be certain," she said. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. "You are a man who weighs the evidence." "No," he said, taking a step closer. "That is not true. I knew the moment you looked at me in the nursery and said no. I knew then. The rest, the investigation, the dinner, that was not for me. It was for them, for the world, so that no one would ever dare to question you again." He stopped before her, so close she could see the flicker of candlelight reflected in his gray eyes. "I have spent 2 years living in a tomb of my own making. I sealed myself off, sealed this house off. I thought that was the only way to honor her memory, to protect myself from any more pain. I was wrong." He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and strong. "You came into this house, and you did not try to blast the doors down. You just found a key. You let the light in, quietly, patiently. You did not erase the past. You made space for a future." He looked around the room, at the warm, clean space,
And then his eyes returned to hers. This house is not just wood and stone. It is a home again. My daughter is not just a solemn little ghost. She is a happy child again. And I am not just a custodian of grief. I am a living man again. Because of you. His words were plain, unadorned, but they struck her with more force than any flowery poetry. This was not a declaration of passion. It was a statement of truth. The contract we made is insufficient, he said, his voice growing thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I offered you a title and a fortune. It is not enough. It is nothing compared to what you have given me. He went down on one knee before her, there in the quiet drawing room. He still held her hand, his grip firm and reverent. Constance, I am not asking you to continue as my Duchess in name.
I'm asking you to be my wife. In truth, in partnership, in all things. I am asking you to choose me as I choose you. He looked up at her, his proud, guarded face filled with a raw, hopeful vulnerability. I love you, Constance Devereux, plainly and with all my heart. Tears she had refused to shed for a decade of cruelty and humiliation now welled in her eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming joy. She had come to Kestrel Chase seeking freedom from a cage, only to find that the truest freedom was in choosing to build a new life with another. She knelt before him so they were face to face. Gideon, she whispered, the first time she had ever used his name. It felt right. It felt like coming home. Yes, plainly, together. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding recognition. It was a promise, a beginning. In the quiet, candlelit heart of the house she had saved, their new life was sealed. 2 years later, the nursery was the undisputed heart of Kestrel Chase. The ceiling was a masterpiece, a perfect celestial map of the northern sky, with the Great Bear and Little Bear shining down in silver leaf. A large, comfortable sofa had replaced the shrouded furniture, and the shelves were overflowing with books and wooden toys. The magnificent rocking horse was worn smooth from countless hours of play. It was Rosamond's favorite room, a place of sanctuary and imagination. She was 7 now, a bright, confident girl with her mother's steady gaze and her father's quiet strength. She no longer bore the pinched, anxious look of a child burdened by grief. She was simply happy. Constance sat on the sofa, a sleeping infant in her arms. A son, a new beginning, named Ambrose. Rosamond was curled beside her, tracing the constellations in a picture book. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes that now danced with life, not decay. The room was filled with the quiet, contented sounds of a family at peace. Gideon came in, shedding the cares of the estate at the door. He smiled as he looked at them, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. It was a sight that never failed to make Constance's heart feel full to bursting. He came and sat on the other side of her, draping an arm around her shoulders. He leaned over and kissed the top of their son's head, then gently kissed his wife. "All is well?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "All is well," she confirmed, leaning her head against his shoulder. He looked up at the silver stars on the ceiling, the project she had started in defiance and finished in love. He thought of the cold, silent man he had been, the man who had ordered this room to be a tomb. And he looked at the woman beside him,
the quiet, competent woman who had not been intimidated by his grief or his title. The woman who had simply opened a locked door and let the light back into his life.
The broken bird cage still stood by the window. Constance had repaired it painstakingly, piece by piece. Its door now stood wide open. It was not a cage anymore. It was a sculpture. A symbol of a freedom found not in flight, but in the deliberate, patient building of a home. Together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.